7-year-old twins stun the judge with their legal brilliance, shocking the entire courtroom. Before anything else, if you're watching this from a place of struggle, know that you're not alone. Drop a heart below. The silence in Denver's courthouse was deafening as Judge Patricia Hernandez called the case of Robert Wilson to order. The 72-year-old grandfather sat hunched in his chair, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he faced accusations of embezzling $75,000 from the Denver Children's Foundation. "Your Honor," came a clear, determined voice from the gallery, "we request permission to testify in defense of our grandfather." Every head in the courtroom turned to see 13-year-old twins, Madison and Mackenzie Wilson, standing side by side, their matching brown hair pulled back in neat ponytails, each clutching a carefully organized notebook. Their eyes held a maturity that seemed far beyond their years. Judge Hernandez raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Young ladies, this is a serious criminal proceeding." "We understand that, Your Honor," Madison interrupted respectfully. "That's exactly why we need to speak. We've been living with Grandpa Robert for 3 years now, ever since our parents died in that car accident. We know him better than anyone in this room." Prosecutor Daniel Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. In his seat, he had prepared for character witnesses, but not for children. "Your Honor, surely the testimony of minors has just as much validity as any other eyewitness account," Mackenzie finished firmly. "We've been investigating this case for 4 months, and we have evidence that no one else has seen." Robert Wilson's eyes filled with tears as he watched his granddaughters stand up for him with unwavering determination. These were the same little girls who had come to him broken and grieving just 3 years ago. Now they were his champions, ready to fight for his honor when everything seemed lost. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as Judge Hernandez studied the twins' earnest faces. Whatever happened next would change all their lives forever. 3 years earlier, Robert Wilson had been a different man. A recently widowed accountant enjoying his retirement, he spent his days tending his garden and volunteering at the Denver Children's Foundation, where he'd served as treasurer for 8 years. His quiet life was shattered by a single phone call. "Mr. Wilson, this is Denver General Hospital. There's been an accident. His son Michael and daughter-in-law Sarah were gone in an instant, leaving behind 10-year-old twins who barely knew their grandfather." Madison and Mackenzie arrived at his modest home with nothing but grief and 2 small suitcases. "I don't know how to take care of children," Robert had whispered to his neighbor that first night as the girls slept fitfully upstairs. "I raised one son, and look how that turned out. He moved across the country and I barely saw him twice a year. But love has a way of teaching us what we never thought we could learn." Within months, Robert had transformed his spare bedroom into a cheerful space with twin beds and a shared desk. He learned to braid hair, pack school lunches, and navigate the mysterious world of teenage emotions. The twins, in turn, watched their grandfather with curious eyes as he spent his evenings reviewing the Foundation's books with meticulous care. They saw how he would frown over discrepancies, call other board members to clarify expenses, and never sign a check without double-checking every detail. "Why do you work so hard on those papers, Grandpa?" Mackenzie had asked one evening. "Because every dollar we manage belongs to children who need help," Robert replied solemnly. "That's a sacred trust, sweetheart. We can never be careless with other people's hope." Those words would echo in their minds 6 months ago when the accusations first surfaced, setting the twins on a path that would test everything their grandfather had taught them about truth, justice, and the power of careful observation. 4 months before the trial, the Wilson household had been turned upside down by a knock at the door. Detective Maria Santos stood on their porch with a search warrant, her expression apologetic but firm. "What's this about?" Robert asked, his face pale as officers began examining his home office. Allegations of embezzlement from the Denver Children's Foundation, sir. We need to examine your financial records. The twins watched from the staircase as their grandfather's world crumbled. Madison grabbed Mackenzie's hand as they overheard. Phrases like $75,000 and systematic theft over 6 months. That night, after Robert had gone to bed early with a headache, the twins sat in their room with Madison's notebook open between them. "This doesn't make sense," Madison whispered. "Remember how Grandpa always makes us count our allowance twice before we spend it? He's obsessed with being careful with money." Mackenzie nodded thoughtfully. "And what about that time he found a $20 bill in the grocery store parking lot? He spent an hour trying to find the owner before finally turning it in to customer service. We need to help him," Madison declared, "but we need to be smart about it." The next day at school, they approached their favorite teacher, Mrs. Sarah Coleman, who had known their family since they started attending Jefferson Middle School. "Mrs. Coleman," Madison began carefully, "if we wanted to do a research project about investigating inconsistencies in accusations, would you help us understand how to document evidence properly?" Mrs. Coleman studied their serious faces. She had heard about Robert's situation through the school's parent network and suspected the twins' sudden interest in investigative methods wasn't coincidental. "Research projects require systematic observation and careful documentation," she said slowly. "But they also require permission from parents or guardians to visit any locations outside school." Within a week, the twins had official permission for their social studies project and began their careful investigation into the very foundation where their grandfather had poured his heart for 8 years. The Denver Children's Foundation occupied a cheerful yellow building downtown, filled with the laughter of children attending after-school programs. The twins visited twice a week, ostensibly to help with tutoring younger kids, but actually to observe the patterns they had begun to notice. Stephen Parker, the administrative director, was a nervous man in his mid-30s who always seemed to be checking his phone. The twins noticed he became particularly agitated whenever Robert wasn't present for his usual volunteer shifts. "Girls, you don't need to be here today," Stephen had said one Tuesday afternoon when Robert was at a doctor's appointment. "Maybe you should head home early." But Madison and Mackenzie stayed, quietly helping children with homework while keeping their eyes and ears open. They watched Stephen access the computer system that required 2 signatures for any significant financial transactions, Robert's and his own. "That's normal," Mackenzie whispered to Madison as they walked home. "Grandpa explained that the foundation requires dual authorization to prevent any single person from misusing funds. Then why does Stephen look so guilty every time he uses the system when Grandpa isn't there?" Madison wondered aloud. The twins began documenting their observations with the methodical precision their grandfather had unknowingly taught them. Madison tracked Stephen's behavior patterns, noting his increased nervousness on specific dates. Mackenzie focused on overhead conversations, carefully writing down fragments of phone calls that seemed suspicious. One afternoon, they overheard Stephen on the phone in his office. "I know the hospital can't wait much longer. Yes, I can get the money, but I need another week. My son needs this surgery now." The twins exchanged glances. They were beginning to see a pattern, but they needed more evidence before they could understand what it really meant. What they didn't realize was that their careful observations were about to uncover a truth that would shock everyone involved, including Stephen Parker himself. The breakthrough came when Madison discovered something crucial while helping her grandfather organize his medical appointments. Robert had been managing diabetes for several years, requiring regular visits to his endocrinologist, Dr. Patricia Martinez. "Grandpa, you have a lot of doctor visits marked in your calendar," Madison observed casually as they sat at the kitchen table. "Diabetes doesn't manage itself, sweetheart. Robert sighed. Dr. Martinez insists on seeing me every 2 weeks to monitor my blood sugar levels. It's been quite a journey these past 6 months. Madison carefully noted the dates in her investigation notebook. That evening, she compared them with the timeline Detective Santos had mentioned during the search, the dates when the alleged embezzlement occurred. "Mackenzie, look at this," she whispered excitedly. "Every single date when money supposedly went missing, Grandpa was at Dr. Martinez's office. Look, March 15th, doctor visit. March 15th, alleged theft. April 2nd, doctor visit. April 2nd, alleged theft. That's not a coincidence," Mackenzie breathed. "Someone knew exactly when Grandpa would be away from the foundation." The twins realized they needed medical records to prove their grandfather's whereabouts, but they also knew they needed permission from Robert himself. That conversation happened the next morning over breakfast. "Grandpa," Madison began carefully, "we think someone at the foundation has been using your scheduled absences to do things you're being blamed for." Robert's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "What do you mean?" "We've been watching and listening," Mackenzie explained. "Stephen Parker always acts strange when you're not there, and we overheard him talking about needing money for his son's surgery." Robert's face grew thoughtful. "Stephen's little boy has been having heart problems. The surgery is expensive, and I know his insurance denied coverage for the experimental procedure. We need your medical records to prove where you were on those days," Madison said firmly. "Will you help us get them?" For the first time in months, Robert Wilson smiled with genuine hope. His granddaughters were fighting for him with the same careful attention to detail he had taught them through years of patient example. "Let's call Dr. Martinez right now," he said, reaching for the phone. "It's time to prove the truth." Dr. Patricia Martinez had been Robert Wilson's physician for over 5 years, and she remembered him as one of her most conscientious patients. When the twins explained their need for medical records to establish their grandfather's whereabouts, she immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Wilson has never missed an appointment in 5 years, Dr. Martinez confirmed during their meeting. "On every date you've mentioned, he was here for exactly 2 hours, 1 hour for examination and blood work, 1 hour waiting for results." Armed with official medical documentation, the twins felt they had built a strong foundation for their grandfather's defense. But they knew they needed something more. They needed to demonstrate the kind of man Robert Wilson truly was. That evening they asked their grandfather to tell them stories they had never heard before about his life with their grandmother, his military service, and his dedication to helping others. "After your grandmother died," Robert shared quietly, "I didn't know how to go on. The foundation gave me purpose. Every child we help there reminds me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow." Madison carefully documented these conversations, but she also made another discovery while organizing Robert's personal papers. Hidden in his desk drawer were 2 sealed envelopes marked "For Madison" and "For Mackenzie in case I don't come home." With trembling hands, they opened the letters their grandfather had written in preparation for a possible conviction. "My dearest granddaughters," Robert's careful handwriting began, "if you are reading this, it means I have been found guilty of a crime I did not commit. Please do not let this destroy your faith in justice or in the goodness of people. Sometimes the truth takes time to emerge, but it always does eventually." The letters continued with memories of their parents, advice for their futures, and expressions of pride in the young women they were becoming. Most importantly, Robert had written detailed instructions for their continued education and care, including the revelation that he had secretly sold his father's vintage watch, his most treasured possession, to ensure they would have college funds regardless of what happened to him. By the time they finished reading, both twins were crying. They finally understood the full magnitude of their grandfather's sacrifice and love. Tomorrow, they would share not just evidence of his innocence, but testimony about the depth of his character. The truth was about to set them all free, but first, they had to find the courage to speak it in front of a room full of strangers. The courtroom was packed as Madison and Mackenzie Wilson took their places at the witness stand. Judge Hernandez had spent considerable time in chambers deliberating whether to allow minor children to testify, ultimately deciding that their direct observations were relevant to the case. Prosecutor Rodriguez remained skeptical. "Your Honor, while I respect these young ladies' desire to help their grandfather, we cannot allow emotional appeals to overshadow concrete evidence of financial irregularities." Defense attorney Marcus Thompson stood to address the court. "Your Honor, these witnesses have compiled systematic documentation that directly relates to the timeline of alleged crimes. Their testimony is factual, not emotional." Madison spoke first, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. "We created a timeline showing that Grandpa Robert was at Dr. Martinez's office during every instance when money allegedly went missing. We have medical records proving this." She presented the carefully organized documentation explaining how they had cross-referenced appointment schedules with bank transaction dates. The courtroom listened in fascination as a 13-year-old girl demonstrated investigative skills that had escaped the adults involved in the case. Mackenzie then shared their behavioral observations of Stephen Parker. "We noticed that Mr. Parker became very nervous whenever Grandpa wasn't at the foundation. We also overheard phone conversations about hospital bills and needing money urgently." "Objection," Rodriguez interrupted. "Hearsay from minors." "Your Honor," Judge Hernandez interrupted, "I'll allow the testimony regarding direct observations of behavior patterns." As Mackenzie continued her testimony, describing Stephen's suspicious actions and apparent distress about his son's medical needs, the courtroom atmosphere began to shift. Even Rodriguez found himself leaning forward, intrigued by the methodical approach these young girls had taken. Robert Wilson watched his granddaughters with tears streaming down his face. These were the same little girls who had arrived at his doorstep 3 years ago, broken and lost. Now they stood before a court of law, fighting for his honor with courage and intelligence that took his breath away. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come. In the gallery, Stephen Parker had been listening to every word, his face growing paler with each revelation. Finally, as the weight of watching an innocent man suffer became unbearable, he stood up abruptly. "Your Honor," Stephen's voice cracked, "I need to confess something." Stephen Parker's words sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Judge Hernandez immediately called for order as the gallery erupted in whispered conversations and gasps of surprise. "Mr. Parker," the judge said sternly, "you are not currently under oath, and I must advise you that anything you say can be used against you in legal proceedings." "I understand, Your Honor," Stephen replied, his voice shaking. "But I can't sit here and watch Mr. Wilson be destroyed for something he didn't do. Those girls are right about everything." Stephen's confession unfolded like pieces of a tragic puzzle finally falling into place. His 2-year-old son, Marcus, had been born with a rare congenital heart defect requiring experimental surgery that cost exactly $75,000. When their insurance company denied coverage, calling the procedure investigational, Stephen and his wife faced an impossible choice: watch their child die or find the money somehow. "I knew Robert's medical schedule," Stephen admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "As administrative director, I had legitimate co-signing authority for emergency situations. I told myself I was borrowing the money, that I would replace it when we sold our house." The twins listened with a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. They had been right about Stephen's behavior, but they hadn't fully understood the desperate circumstances driving it. The Foundation's emergency protocol allows the administrative director to authorize transactions when the treasurer is unavailable, Stephen continued. It's designed for genuine emergencies, natural disasters, urgent repairs. I perverted it. To steal from the children we were supposed to protect. Judge Hernandez maintained her stern expression. Mr. Parker, do you understand that you are essentially confessing to embezzlement in open court? Yes, Your Honor, and I have the full $75,000 ready for immediate restitution, plus interest. We sold our house 3 weeks ago. Robert Wilson stood slowly, his legs unsteady from months of stress and worry. Stephen, he said quietly, why didn't you come to me? We could have worked something out. The Foundation has emergency assistance programs for employees' families. Stephen's tears came freely now. I was too proud, too ashamed. And then, when the investigation started pointing at you, I was too scared to come forward. These girls showed more courage in 4 months than I've shown in my entire life. Madison and Mackenzie exchanged glances, their hearts heavy with the complexity of the situation. They had solved the mystery, but the solution revealed a tragedy that went far deeper than simple theft. 3 years had passed since that dramatic day in court, and the Wilson family had learned to live with the complex emotions that followed Stephen Parker's confession. Now 16 years old, Madison and Mackenzie were seniors at Jefferson High School, their reputation for analytical thinking and fairness well established among their peers. Robert, now 75, had been completely exonerated and returned to his volunteer work at the Denver Children's Foundation with renewed purpose. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about recognizing signs of employee distress, and he had helped implement new support systems for staff facing personal crises. Stephen Parker had served his sentence through an innovative restorative justice program. Full restitution of $75,000 plus $15,000 in interest, combined with 200 hours monthly volunteering his accounting skills for non-profit audits. His son Marcus, now 5 years old, was healthy and thriving after the successful surgery. Stephen had become a passionate advocate for non-profit transparency and financial accountability. The twins had channeled their courthouse experience into school activities that reflected their growing interest in justice and truth-seeking. Madison served as president of the Mock Trial Club, while Mackenzie led the Student Government Accountability Committee, which ensured transparent reporting of how student fees were spent. You know what I learned from Grandpa Robert's case? Madison said during a school presentation about their volunteer work. The truth isn't always obvious on the surface. Sometimes you have to dig deeper, ask better questions, and look at patterns. Over time, their methodology, systematic observation, timeline correlation, and behavioral pattern analysis had become their signature approach to problem solving. Teachers regularly consulted them when investigating academic misconduct, and their principal had asked them to help redesign the school's honor code system. Most importantly, they had learned that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about understanding, restoration, and preventing future harm. Stephen Parker's case had taught them that good people sometimes make terrible choices when faced with impossible circumstances. As they prepared for college applications, both twins knew their future lay in law, but their approach would always be colored by the lessons learned in that Denver courtroom when they were just 13 years old. At 22 years old, Madison and Mackenzie Wilson graduated from University of Colorado Law School with specializations that reflected their unique perspective on justice. Madison focused on family law with an emphasis on elder protection, while Mackenzie concentrated on corporate compliance and financial fraud prevention. Their senior thesis, Behavioral Pattern Analysis in Financial Crimes Against Vulnerable Populations, had caught the attention of several law firms and advocacy organizations. The twins had refined the investigative methodology they first developed as teenagers, creating a systematic approach to identifying financial abuse that traditional audit methods often missed. During their final semester, they interned together at Martinez and Associates, a firm specializing in elder abuse cases. Their supervising attorney, Maria Martinez, was impressed by their unconventional but effective approach to case investigation. Most law students focus on legal precedents and courtroom strategies, Maria observed during their final evaluation. You two approach cases like detectives, looking for behavioral inconsistencies and timeline correlations that reveal the human story behind the legal issues. Their internship involved 17 cases of suspected financial elder abuse, ranging from family members stealing from aging parents to caretakers exploiting their positions of trust. In 14 of those cases, the twins' pattern analysis had uncovered evidence that more traditional investigation methods had missed. One particular case resonated deeply with their personal experience. Elderly Margaret Chen had been systematically defrauded by her live-in caretaker, who had legitimate access to her financial accounts for bill-paying purposes. The twins recognized the same pattern they had observed with Stephen Parker, someone with authorized access abusing that trust during predictable absence periods. The key insight, Mackenzie explained to their law school classmates during a presentation, is understanding that financial abuse often occurs within legitimate relationships. It's not strangers breaking in, it's trusted individuals gradually expanding their authorized access. Their professor, Dr. James Richardson, encouraged them to consider academia. Your approach could revolutionize how we teach financial crime investigation. Have you thought about pursuing graduate research? But the twins had different plans. They wanted to practice law, not just study it. More importantly, they wanted to help families navigate the same kind of crisis they had faced with their grandfather. Their personal experience had given them insights that no textbook could provide. At 25, Madison and Mackenzie Wilson opened their practice in downtown Denver, just 6 blocks from the courthouse where they had testified 12 years earlier. Wilson & Wilson, Elder Protection and Financial Justice, specialized in cases involving exploitation of vulnerable adults, with a focus on situations where abuse occurred within trusted relationships. Their approach, now formally known as the Wilson Method, combined traditional legal investigation with systematic behavioral analysis and timeline correlation. They had developed standardized protocols for documenting suspicious patterns, cross-referencing medical schedules with financial transactions, and identifying the psychological profiles of individuals who abuse positions of trust. The method's effectiveness quickly gained attention in legal circles. Unlike traditional approaches that focus primarily on financial audits after suspicious activity was already suspected, the Wilson method could identify potential abuse patterns before significant damage occurred. Their first major case involved the Hendricks family, where 78-year-old Dorothy Hendricks suspected her nephew James was misusing his power of attorney. Traditional auditing had found no obvious irregularities, but the twins applied their timeline analysis and discovered that unusual financial activity consistently occurred during Dorothy's dialysis appointments, times when James knew exactly where she would be for predictable 3-hour periods. The beauty of the Wilson method, Madison explained to a conference of elder law attorneys, is that it recognizes patterns that financial audits miss. Authorized users don't leave obvious traces of theft. They leave behavioral traces of guilt and opportunity. Within 3 years, their methodology had been adopted by elder protection agencies in 12 states. The Colorado Department of Human Services reported an 89% success rate in detecting financial abuse when the Wilson method was properly implemented, compared to 34% with traditional audit-only approaches. Mackenzie had developed the training protocols, teaching other attorneys and social workers how to recognize the subtle signs they had first observed in Stephen Parker's behavior. Nervous energy around the vulnerable person, excessive interest in their medical schedules, resistance to transparency about financial decisions. These are red flags that numbers alone won't reveal. But perhaps most significantly, their work had attracted the attention of Stephen Parker himself, who had completed his community service and was now working as a non-profit financial transparency consultant. He approached them with a proposal that would test everything they believed about justice, redemption, and second chances. Stephen Parker's proposal was both surprising and controversial. He wanted to work with the Wilson twins to develop training, programs that would help non-profit organizations prevent the kind of financial abuse he had committed 8 years earlier. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to partner with," Stephen said during their initial meeting at the Wilson offices, "but I understand the mindset of someone who abuses authorized access because I've been there. I can teach organizations to recognize warning signs that even your method might miss." The twins found themselves in an ethical dilemma that echoed the complexity of their grandfather's original case. Stephen had paid his debt to society, made full restitution, and spent years working to prevent others from making his mistakes. His son Marcus, now 10 years old and healthy, was thriving in school and completely unaware of his father's past crimes. "This isn't about forgiveness," Madison said carefully. "It's about effectiveness. If your insights can prevent other families from going through what Grandpa Robert experienced, then we have an obligation to consider it." Mackenzie was more skeptical. "But how do we know this isn't just an attempt at reputation rehabilitation? How do we know your motivations are genuine?" Stephen's response surprised them both. "You don't, and you shouldn't take my word for it. Apply your own method to evaluate me. Look at my behavioral patterns over the past 8 years. Cross-reference my volunteer hours with my financial disclosures. Talk to the families I've helped and the organizations where I've worked. If your analysis shows inconsistencies or red flags, then don't work with me." This was unprecedented. A potential partner, essentially asking to be investigated by the very method he hoped to help improve. The twins spent 6 weeks conducting a thorough analysis of Stephen's post-conviction life, interviewing his supervisors, reviewing his financial records, and observing his interactions with vulnerable populations during his volunteer work. Their conclusion was complex but clear. Stephen Parker had genuinely transformed his life. But more importantly, his insider knowledge of financial abuse psychology could help strengthen their prevention methods in ways they hadn't considered. Robert Wilson, now 78 and still volunteering at the Denver Children's Foundation, gave his blessing to the partnership. "Redemption isn't just about paying for mistakes," he told his granddaughters. "It's about using those mistakes to prevent others from suffering the same harm." The testing ground for their enhanced methodology came sooner than expected. Margaret Thompson, a 79-year-old retired teacher, was referred to Wilson by her concerned neighbors. Her 14-year-old twin grandsons, Kevin and Kyle, had approached their school counselor with suspicions about their grandmother's live-in caretaker, David Cruz. The case was remarkably similar to Robert Wilson's situation from 20 years earlier. An elderly person with legitimate medical needs, a caretaker with authorized access to financial accounts, and observant young relatives who noticed behavioral inconsistencies that adults had missed. "David always gets nervous when Grandma has doctor appointments," Kevin explained during their initial consultation. "And he tries to keep us away from the house on those days." Kyle added, We started writing down when weird things happen, just like you two did with your grandpa. David talks on the phone about needing money, and it's always on days when Grandma isn't home. Madison and Mackenzie exchanged glances, seeing their 13-year-old selves reflected in these earnest teenagers. The twins applied the Wilson method to Margaret's case, but this time they had Stephen Parker's additional insights about the psychological patterns of financial abusers. Caretakers who abuse their position often develop ritual behaviors around their crimes, Stephen explained during their case conference. They convince themselves they're borrowing, not stealing, so they create elaborate justifications and timing patterns that make them feel less guilty. The enhanced investigation revealed that David had been systematically transferring money during Margaret's dialysis appointments, using her debit card for cash advances that he categorized as emergency medical expenses. The timing was so precise and predictable that it created a clear behavioral signature. When confronted with the evidence, David broke down and confessed, revealing that he needed money for his mother's cancer treatments in Mexico. Like Stephen Parker years earlier, he had started with good intentions, but had crossed ethical and legal boundaries when desperation overcame judgment. Margaret Thompson chose to handle the situation through restorative justice rather than criminal prosecution, with David making full restitution and agreeing to community service while receiving help finding legitimate resources for his mother's medical care. As Kevin and Kyle watched their grandmother's compassionate response to David's confession, they learned the same lesson the Wilson twins had absorbed years earlier. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about understanding, prevention, and helping people find better choices when facing impossible circumstances. At 35 years, old Madison and Mackenzie Wilson stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Elder Protection, accepting the prestigious Innovation in Legal Practice Award for the Wilson Method. Their systematic approach to detecting financial abuse had been adopted by agencies in 42 states and had prevented an estimated $12 million in elder financial exploitation over the past decade. "This award belongs to our grandfather, Robert Wilson," Madison said during their acceptance speech. "He taught us that protecting vulnerable people isn't just a professional obligation. It's a sacred trust that requires both systematic vigilance and genuine compassion." The statistics were impressive. Organizations using the Wilson method detected 89% of financial abuse cases within the first 3 months, compared to 34% detection rates using traditional audit-only approaches. More importantly, early detection meant smaller financial losses and less psychological trauma for victims. Stephen Parker, now a respected consultant who had trained over 1,500 nonprofit staff members in financial transparency protocols, watched from the audience with quiet satisfaction. His partnership with the Wilson twins had evolved into something none of them could have predicted: a comprehensive prevention system that addressed both the technical and psychological aspects of financial abuse. "The most significant thing we've learned," Mackenzie told the audience, "is that financial abuse rarely happens in isolation. It's usually connected to personal crises, mental health struggles, or systemic failures in support systems. Prevention requires addressing those root causes, not just implementing better security measures." In the audience, Robert Wilson sat in his wheelchair, now 88 years old, and managing the early stages of vascular dementia related to his long-term diabetes. His granddaughters had become his full-time caregivers, applying the same protective protocols they had developed professionally to ensure his safety and dignity. The irony wasn't lost on them. The same systematic observation skills they had developed as 13-year-olds to protect their grandfather were now being used to care for him in his declining years. Their professional success had grown directly from their personal experience, creating a legacy that would outlast all of them. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came not from professional awards, but from families like the Hendricks, the Thompsons, and dozens of others who had been protected from financial exploitation because two teenage girls had refused to accept their grandfather's guilt without investigating the truth for themselves. Once, a quiet Tuesday morning in March, Robert Wilson passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 88, 16 years after that dramatic day in the Denver courthouse. His granddaughters, now 38 years old, sat beside his bed holding his hands as he took his final breath, their hearts full of gratitude for the man who had shaped their lives with patience, integrity, and unconditional love. The funeral. Service at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church was standing room only. Representatives from 127 families who had been protected by the Wilson method came to pay their respects, along with colleagues from law enforcement, social services, and legal advocacy organizations across the country. Stephen Parker spoke at the service, his voice steady but emotional. Robert Wilson taught me that redemption isn't about erasing our mistakes. It's about using them to serve others better. He could have destroyed me when I confessed to framing him, but instead he chose to understand, forgive, and help me find a path forward. That grace changed not just my life, but the lives of every family we've been able to protect since then. In the weeks following Robert's death, Madison and Mackenzie established the Robert Wilson Institute for Elder Protection, a non-profit organization dedicated to training families, caregivers, and community organizations in recognizing and preventing financial abuse. The Institute's 3 core programs reflected everything their grandfather had taught them about protecting vulnerable people. The Family Guardian program taught relatives how to implement systematic oversight of elderly family members' financial affairs without being intrusive or disrespectful. The Caregiver Certification Program provided training in ethical standards and transparent financial management for professional caregivers. The Community Watch Initiative helped neighbors and friends recognize warning signs of exploitation. Their first case at the Institute came just 3 months after Robert's death. 12-year-old twins Emma and Ella Martinez approached them with concerns about their great-grandfather's nephew, who seemed to be pressuring the elderly man to sign financial documents during family visits. As Madison and Mackenzie sat across from these earnest young girls, so reminiscent of themselves 25 years earlier, they felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that their grandfather's legacy would continue protecting families for generations to come. Age doesn't matter when it comes to observing suspicious behavior, Mackenzie told Emma and Ella during their first meeting. What matters is knowing what to look for, how to document it systematically, and having the courage to speak up when something doesn't feel right. Madison added, "Your great-grandfather is lucky to have you watching out for him, just like our grandpa was lucky to have us." As the Wilson Institute's work expanded to help families across the country, the twins often reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with 2 frightened 13-year-olds standing up in a courtroom to defend their grandfather's honor. They had learned that justice wasn't a destination. It was a daily choice to protect the vulnerable, seek the truth, and believe in the possibility of redemption for everyone willing to take responsibility for their actions. Robert Wilson's voice lived on in every family they helped, every caregiver they trained, and every young person who learned that age was no barrier to standing up for what was right. His greatest legacy wasn't the money he had protected or the innocence he had maintained. It was the example he had set of how love, patience, and unwavering integrity could transform tragedy into triumph and pain into purpose. The story that began with accusations and ended with vindication had become something far greater, a testament to the power of family, the importance of truth, and the endless possibility for people to learn, grow, and use their experiences to serve others with compassion and wisdom.